The city where Pierre Laurent lived was a real urban monster, sprawling and insatiable. Its glass and concrete skyscrapers rose like the columns of a modern temple dedicated to money and success. The streets were paved with marble, the boulevards lined with luxury boutiques and art galleries. Every building, every stone seemed to whisper stories of conquest, power, and glory. But beneath this resplendent surface, the city hid a much crueler truth. A world where only the strong survived, where wealth didn't just buy comfort, but dictated the way lives intersected, defined and shattered. Pierre, in his ivory tower, had ended up becoming the very incarnation of this city. He was no longer a man, but a symbol. His business prospered thanks to his shrewd decisions, his skillful alliances, and his complete lack of scruples. Every morning, he got up in an apartment whose panoramic view offered a dazzling spectacle of the concrete jungle that the city had become. The morning light was reflected in the facades of the buildings, like a metaphor for the power and brilliance of his life. But inside this empire of glass and steel, another setting had been set up, that of a marriage which, over the years, had lost its essence. Catherine, Pierre's wife, only shined like a precious accessory that he displayed during his social evenings. She too was a conqueror, a strong and ambitious woman, but she had sacrificed her own identity to comply with the demands of a man whose success seemed to encompass everything. Their early years of marriage, full of shared hopes and dreams, were now as distant as the invisible horizon of the city that stretched endlessly beneath their windows. Their love had turned into a routine, a silent dance around money and social status. Catherine, once dynamic and enthusiastic, had faded over the years. Pierre had always seen it as an asset, a means of strengthening his position in the world of business and social relations. It was perfect for receptions, meetings, charity events. But as time passed, he saw her less as an equal partner and more as an ornament he displayed with pride. She had accepted this place, although with each event, a part of her turned off a little more. She had abandoned her dreams, her passions, her career to support him in his incessant quest for power. Her aspirations had been erased, drowned under the sea of expectations from her husband, from the image he wanted to maintain in the eyes of the world. However, deep inside her, a silent revolt was maturing. Catherine knew that her life was no longer hers. She knew that every smile she offered the world was just a facade, a mask she wore to please Pierre and others. But the more she tried to carry it, the heavier it became. When Pierre noticed that Catherine was beginning to demand her independence, it deeply upset him. He thought she was like him, that she lived for the same goals, the same dreams. But she was no longer the ambitious young woman he had married. She had become a specter of his own desires, a decorative object that he had forgotten to nourish. And what struck him even harder was the fact that she dared to defy him, that she had the audacity to want to break the ties that united her to him. This decision, this desire to leave this marriage that he thought was invincible, terrified him. He had built his life around this woman, this perfect image that they formed together. He could not accept the idea of losing her, not only because he was afraid of loneliness, but also because divorce meant a fracture of his empire. Laurent's name, so carefully cultivated, risked breaking under the weight of public revelations. And what terrified him even more was the idea of losing the money he had amassed. These possessions, this house, this life. Everything he had, he owed to his position. Losing Catherine meant not only losing a part of himself, but also risking losing everything. He quickly realized that the legal battle would not be easy. Catherine had taken the initiative to hire a powerful lawyer, someone aggressive and strategic. Discussions about the division of property were taking a much more serious and costly turn than he had imagined. In addition, it was necessary to preserve the image of the perfect family that he strived to maintain. The weeks passed, and the pressure grew stronger and stronger on Pierre. Social evenings were no longer enough to soothe his mind. Every day he got up with the fear of losing everything he had built. And then, in the solitude of his office, with the divorce papers before him, a macabre idea began to form in his mind. If Catherine disappeared, the property would revert to him. The logic was simple. Her death would erase the threat she posed, and the goods would automatically be his. Pierre knew it might be risky, but the obsession with keeping everything he had acquired was eating away at him from the inside. He no longer had room for compassion, for love. He had sacrificed everything on the altar of power and money, and he was no longer able to see himself other than through the prism of his material success. Marriage was nothing more than an obstacle, and Catherine's disappearance was no longer an act of revenge, but a necessity to keep her empire intact. The idea germinated in Pierre's mind like a dark seed, a poison slowly distilled into every fiber of his being. What had started as a simple thought, a radical solution to his problem, transformed into an obsession. Every hour spent talking with his lawyers, every minute one-on-one with his associates, every exchange, every decision, only reinforced his desire to control the situation. He felt trapped by his own ambition, like an actor caught in a role he couldn't leave. The idea of losing was no longer one of his options. Pierre felt vulnerable, a vulnerability he had never experienced before. At the top of his empire, he never had to doubt his place in the world. Affairs were resolved as he wanted, his decisions seemed unshakable, and the world turned according to his desires. But now, faced with the prospect of sharing what he had built, of seeing his glory crumble because of a simple divorce, he felt an uneasiness that grew within him every day. The thought of loss, of the questioning of his social position, of the fragility of his public image, terrified him. He knew he was ready to do anything not to sink. The meeting room, once a place of influence and triumphant decisions, became for him an increasingly oppressive prison. The lawyers who advised him could not understand the noose that was tightening around him. They did not feel the urgency, the absolute necessity that he felt to eliminate this threat to his empire. As the negotiations progressed, Pierre realized that Catherine, through her lawyer, was becoming a more formidable adversary than he had anticipated. She was not just a woman to whom he should have given part of his fortune. No, Catherine had become a barrier against the continuity of his power, and she refused to disappear silently, as he had hoped. Peter had become a man obsessed with control, with the idea of keeping his empire intact. It had almost become a psychological necessity, a personal challenge that he could not let fail. His wife, his life partner, had become an anomaly in this perfect calculation. She wasn't just playing her part. She had her own will. And for the first time in his life, Pierre realized that he could not control what was outside his field of action. This had to stop. Catherine, for her part, did not perceive the depth of the change taking place in Pierre. She believed that her husband, as ruthless as he was in the business world, would remain reasonable in personal matters. Divorce, in his eyes, was just a formality, an administrative act to complete to close a chapter which, even if it had lost its charm, remained respectful of social conventions. She had no idea of the abyss Pierre was falling into, nor of the brutality hidden behind his calculated appearances. For her, the idea of losing this marriage did not mean the end of the world. After all, she had resources, connections, and an image that she could rebuild elsewhere. But Catherine's innocence in this power game would become her tragedy. She believed that the conversation they were going to have that evening, this dinner that Pierre had organized with cold precision, would be an opportunity to lay the foundations for a smooth future separated. She prepared for this meeting with feigned calm, waiting for everything to be over, for them to sign the papers and finally move on. She had no idea that she was about to meet a side of Pierre that she had never seen, a man that she had never imagined capable of such extremes. Pierre had carefully orchestrated this meeting, choosing the perfect setting. Their apartment, this place full of memories and symbols. The breathtaking view of the city, a panorama that symbolized their shared rise, the shared successes, now became the place where it would all end. Dinner was perfect. The conversation, at first cordial, seemed to echo a final attempt at reconciliation, but Catherine did not see that the air around them was heavy with silent promises and unsaid things. Pierre led her near the panoramic window. He spoke to her of their years together, of happy times, of their family, trying to mask the violence of his intentions under a facade of kindness. His words were soft, almost affectionate. But every word he spoke was only a mask intended to hide the atrocious reality of what he had decided. Catherine, however, only perceived the gentleness of his tone. She thought that, perhaps, Pierre would end up accepting the situation, and their separation would take place peacefully. But reality, cold as the winter air, hit her with incredible brutality. In a gesture as sudden as it was merciless, Pierre pushed her violently. Catherine, surprised, did not immediately understand what was happening. Her eyes searched desperately for an explanation in her husband's gaze, but there was only the coldness of indifference. In an instant, she felt her body tilt, cold air rushing against her face. His cry pierced the silence of the room, but it was swallowed up by the wind which carried it away, like a leaf swept away by a storm. Pierre stood there, frozen, petrified by what he had just done. His heart was beating wildly, like a drum announcing the end of a world. He hadn't expected it to end like this. This gesture, which had been conceived in his mind as a quick, almost logical solution, had turned into an irreparable act. What he thought was a means to an end had suddenly turned into a crime, an act of violence he had not anticipated, but could never undo. In this silent room, Pierre knew that his destiny had just changed. He was no longer the successful businessman, the master of his empire. He had become a criminal. And that evening, the city in its icy mist seemed to be watching him, bearing witness to a tragedy that had no possible way back. The days following the tragedy were a whirlwind. Pierre felt like a shipwrecked man, drifting in an ocean of guilt and remorse. What he had done couldn't be undone, and yet he couldn't help but look for a way to escape the reality of his actions. He wandered in his own thoughts, unable to find refuge. He knew the irreparable had happened, but he refused to fully admit it. The authorities, although finding no direct evidence, continued to monitor him, and each suspicious look, each question asked, pushed the needle of guilt further into his mind. He felt the noose slowly tightening around him, every movement in his daily life becoming a fragile dance on the razor's edge. His conscience tormented him. Images of Catherine's fall were constantly superimposed on his thoughts. He saw her again, there, just before he did the irreparable, her eyes filled with confusion, her body unbalanced, then disappearing into the void. This image haunted him every moment, like a persistent shadow that he could not chase away. He wondered if this could have been avoided, if one different gesture, one more word, could have changed the outcome of this night. But deep down, he knew the decision was irrevocable. The consequences of his action were felt quickly, like a wave that engulfed everything in its path. His affairs began to fall apart. The contracts he had so skillfully negotiated began to fall apart one by one. His once loyal associates turned away from him with glacial rapidity. They had seen Peter as a leader, a man of power, but now he was nothing more than a burden, a man whose once solid reputation was now forever tainted. The press, hungry for scandal, seized the affair with unparalleled veracity. The details of what happened in this apartment were gradually revealed to the general public, weaving a macabre and relentless tale. Journalists, eager for sensationalism, transformed the tragedy into a spectacle, and Pierre became the fallen star, a symbol of the corruption of power and all-consuming ambition. Each article, each photo that showed him in an increasingly dark light plunged him deeper into an abyss of shame and loneliness. He found himself isolated in his own home, the walls of the apartment where he had once shared laughter and plans with Catherine becoming mute witnesses to his downfall. He couldn't even find any semblance of comfort there anymore. The loneliness weighed him down. He was looking for, without finding, any way to repair it, but he knew deep down that everything was irreparable. The raw truth was revealed in all its brutality. The insatiable quest for power, the thirst for control, the desire to never give in to loss. All of this had led to his own devastation. Pierre's colleagues, the partners with whom he had built his empire, stopped answering his calls and honoring his appointments. Their silences spoke more eloquently than any words. They too had seen the signs, understood that the man they respected was no longer who he claimed to be. What he had done to Catherine was no longer a secret, and even those who had once admired him in business felt betrayed by his monstrosity. Pierre found himself on the margins, without an ally, without support. He had become an outcast. The void he had created within and around him grew every day. The businesses that had made up his kingdom were collapsing one by one. Contracts cancelled, investors fleeing, his company's stock market index fell, and the reaction of the financial markets was not long in following. Pierre watched helplessly as the empire he had built with so much effort cracked and broke under the weight of shame. What he thought was the key to his victory, his absolute control, was turning against him. The power he had acquired now became a cage. Pierre was now alone. He wandered like a lost soul, haunted by the memory of Catherine. He found himself wondering if she had had one last look at him before disappearing into thin air. If, in that fatal moment, she had perceived something that he had concealed. But these thoughts were traps, thoughts that only brought more pain and confusion. He hated himself, but every moment he also secretly hoped that it was all just a nightmare, a bad joke of life that he would eventually wake up from. But reality was relentless. Everything was broken. Catherine was dead, her empire was disintegrating, and he no longer had a place in this world. He had nothing left. The truth hit him with incredible violence. He had sacrificed everything for power, for status, for control. And in the end, he won nothing. What he believed to be the strength of his ambition was in reality its weakness. His desire to control everything had led him to ruin, to a fall without return. He now found himself in the echo of a life that was only a shadow of what it had been. He no longer had a voice in this world where he had once been a titan. The void, where Catherine had disappeared, resonated within him like an endless abyss. The story of Pierre Laurent was now that of a man consumed by his own demons. He had sacrificed everything for a delusional dream of grandeur and control, and in return, he had gotten nothing. Power, ambition, wealth. All of this had only been of value insofar as it allowed him to stay at the top. But in his relentless quest, he had forgotten a fundamental principle: the balance between what we want and what we are willing to lose. And Pierre had lost everything. He was a man without redemption, a broken soul, lost in the solitude of his thoughts, consumed by guilt. At the bottom of the abyss he had dug for himself, there was only an echo of what had been a brilliant life, but now tarnished, obscured, consumed by the insatiable thirst for power and the irreversible tragedy he had created.